Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Liz O'Heather, and I'm the business consultant with the Mountain Plains Minority Supplier Development Council. Marketing and Branding Made Valuable is presented by Ivan Burwell, who is the CEO of Street Sourcing Marketing, and is brought to you by the University of Nebraska. Ivan is an advertising, marketing, and communication specialist with more than 20 years of experience in strategic development, design, and execution of targeted merchandising and promotional programs. His unique approach has resulted in a very successful track record of building brand equity and generating product trial, resulting in incremental sales that have continuously exceeded expectations. Ivan has also served with distinction on corporate innovation teams, for which the objectives was to identify, evaluate, and recommend new business recommendation strategies and best practices. Now, prior to starting Street Source, Ivan was the first director of ethnic marketing at Coors Brewing Company, right here in Colorado. I'd like to please welcome Ivan Burwell, and you let me know when I start the screen sharing, Ivan.
You can start it now. You're sharing it, Liz?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Can everybody see this? Well, if anybody can't see that, just because you're muted, you can always raise your hand. And Ivan, just let me know when to go to the next screen. Thank you.
Okay, I sure will. Well, Liz, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's really nice to have everyone here. The morning session was just absolutely terrific. And so I'm so pleased that was the kickoff for today. But our subject today is marketing and branding made valuable. And as business owners, that's really what we want. We want to have more value brought to our businesses. But there's been so many pressures on our business, right? Staffing, there are so many issues around inventory and technology and equipment and capital. And then add on to that the pandemic, and it really spins us all in directions that we've never been in before. And so as we begin to prioritize what's important in our businesses, often the subject of marketing and branding doesn't occupy the space that it should, right? We may not recognize the value and importance that marketing and branding would have to our business. So our discussion today is really focused on describing how marketing and branding truly is valuable to your business and how it can add to the growth of your business. So that's the framework, and that's the lens in which we will have our conversation today. So next slide. So let's talk a little bit about this thing called branding, right? And I heard the word differentiate earlier in the segment this morning. And that's an important part of branding, is to differentiate. But it's also important to understand that it also adds a set of personality and traits that begins to position your brand, product, or service in the marketplace in the minds of your most important consumer or customer. So think about this word differentiate as we go through our conversation this morning. Next slide. So let's talk about the subject of brand marketing and its importance to your business. Initially, it's really about identifying or creating an identity for your product, brand, or service, right? It's about understanding those attributes and developing a personality that's distinct, and it's a distinct identity. Think of it as your own DNA as a business operator. It also can transform generic product and or services into something that's uniquely recognizable and memorable. And here's this word differentiate again. It's about differentiating your product and service from the competition. I heard a little bit of that this morning, but it's also about increasing recall and awareness that really adds experience and characteristics to your brand or services for the customer. When you look at the brands here to your right, there's a ton of them: Ford, IBM, Coca-Cola, Levi's. And the immediate response, well, geez, they have a ton of money and a ton of resources, and there's no wonder they have the success that they have. The truth is they still operate the same process of getting to building the brands that are so important in our minds and psyche today. Let's talk about Starbucks for just a second. Starbucks was established in 1971. Can you believe it? It's been years, right? But think of it this way. Many of the millennials and certainly the Gen Xers have no coffee experience other than Starbucks. So in their mind and in their vision, Starbucks is synonymous with coffee. Coffee never existed until Starbucks. No one ever consumed coffee until Starbucks, right? But what Starbucks did was pretty amazing. They created a social ambiance for us to have coffee, right? And to have conversation, to network with each other. And so they transformed the consumption of coffee prior to that point to something that was really connecting, and they connected us. And so that's just an example of a brand that understood its identity, it differentiated itself from the very beginning, and it created a culture. They created this amazing coffee culture. Next slide, please. The other part of this process is to create trust with your customers, right? Create a relationship based on the experience with your brand, product, or service. And this trust helps to sustain continuity for your brand, product, or service with not only with the customer, but with your client. It also increases overall market value. And this is really important. All of these brands to the right have wonderful brand equity. And they achieve that by defining and investing in their brand over time. And so the value for us as customers makes it important. That's why we choose Coca-Cola over another brand, or John Deere, or Starbucks, or Levi's. It's based on our trust, our belief, and the value we placed in those brands. It also attracts new customers, and that's really important, right? It's to attract new customers to your business and leave an impression in their mind. And lastly here, it really creates trust and satisfaction for your employees. They are your best brand ambassadors, right? And if they're happy, it creates respect and a reputation for your brand, products, or service. Next slide, please, Liz. So let's talk about this thing called branding and what the definition is. According to the American Marketing Association, they define a brand as a name, term, sign, symbol, or design, or a combination of them intended to identify the goods, services, or products and to differentiate them from competitors. There's that word again, differentiation. And for successful brands, they actually teach customers and us as consumers how to think about it. They give us the who, the what, and the why. Who is your product? You know, who is the product, right? What does the product do? And why should consumers choose your brand over the competition? So what is the product? What does the product do? Who is the product for? And why should consumers think about it? And these are questions that we have to ask ourselves as business owner as we begin getting closer to defining who we are as a brand, product, or service. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about branding and its importance in marketing. It clearly delivers the message about your brand, product, or service. It creates a user loyalty that's important. It confirms your credibility as a brand or organization. And here's one, it actually emotionally connects your target prospect with your product. And I wanted to talk about sort of this brand benefits. And when you think about brands, they have a functional, or what we call rational benefit, and they have an emotional benefit. For example, take a brand like Tide. Tide's functional benefit is that it gets your clothes whiter and cleaner. And they drive that home to all of us, right, through their commercials. That's a functional or rational benefit. The emotional benefit is your family will have the brightest and cleanest clothes, perhaps in the neighborhood. That's more of an emotional, visceral benefit. But there's another brand that's interesting for me, and that's Peloton. And often that Peloton commercial sort of resonates with me. It just rings in my head continuously. And when you think about what Peloton is, it's a stationary bike, okay? At the core. Now, clearly it's more than that. And it's what work they have done to impress on our minds sort of the benefit. They talk about it as we've created an opportunity for people to discover the best version of themselves through the power of sweat. Right, just think about that for a second. It's a stationary bike, but let's move beyond that. I'm just talking about how they're differentiating themselves as a brand and as a product. Here's their mission statement. Peloton uses technology and design to connect the whole world through fitness, empowering people to be the best version of themselves anywhere, anytime. It's more of an emotional connection, creating a community. People are connected around the world and workouts. They have these immersive challenge workouts, right? But think about what it is at the core. What's the functional value of the brand that they get $2,000 for, right? Plus all of the interactivity to engage you or engage us as customers. But that's about understanding the identity of their brand, understanding how to differentiate, and understand those emotional connectors that we as customers and consumers, that drives us, right? That drives our behavior. It also motivates the buyer to buy, right? And then branding is really getting your customer to select over the competition. That's how we normally think about sort of branding, right? It's having our client choose us over the competition. But the truth is, it's about getting your prospect to see you as the sole provider uh, of a solution or a need. That's a very different mindset than winning against the competition. It's more of a blue ocean perspective to get your client to see you as the sole provider of a product or service. There's a lot of volume in that idea, isn't it? Right. But again, we sort of wrestle with this whole notion of, fighting it out, duking it out with our competitors versus seeing ourselves as the sole provider and the sole solution for a product and service. Next slide. So let's talk about sort of brand success. You obviously want to understand the needs and wants of your customer and prospects, right? And seeing brands more as a living and breathing entity, right? Versus something that's just one dimensional. But it's also important to spend time researching and defining and building your brand, right? And this notion of research is often lost on smaller businesses, right? Large businesses invest in research all the time, but about how you are building your story back to your most important client. It's about data. It's about what we know about the customer that influences the distinction or the differentiation between us and a competitor. And here's the good news, there's so much information available. There's so much data available, so much research available that we all have access. And it's about how to integrate that into building a better story for your brand, product, or service, right? And here are a couple of things to think about or questions to ask. Did your product or service perform as you expected? Was the quality as good as promised or better? And was the entire experience positive? I mean, how do you speak to that as an organization? Next slide. And just to build on that, let's think of this as a bit of a brand checklist, right? Does the brand relate to my target audience or my primary customer? Will they gravitate to it? Does the brand share the uniqueness of what I'm offering? Is it important to my customer? Does the brand reflect the promises made to my most important customer? Does the brand reflect the values I want to represent to my customer? And here's a checklist that as you're thinking about your brand product or service, how do you measure up against this checklist and against the customer, right? Next slide. This is really an important area here, and we call it sort of the equity bucket. And these are things, obviously big companies wrestle with all the time, but it's really more about smaller and medium companies. Think about this. What makes you special? Can you address what makes your brand, product, or service special? It's pretty difficult, right? To think about what makes you special. And then secondly, what do we offer our clients or customers that is different or more value? What are you offering your clients or customers something that is either different or more valuable than your competitors, right? Being able to delineate that is very, very important. And in a sense, can you summarize what you can do for your most important customers? Just in a sentence, can you be that clear about what you can do for your most important customer? And then how do you attract new customers in a sense? So if you had a hook, what is that hook that you would use to attract new customers to your products or services? And this last point here, I feel is really important, which is how do I build a value-driven organization? And, certainly based on what we've encountered with the pandemic and all of the unrest last summer, I mean, how do you drive more value? Not just about commercial enterprise, what you sell or what you do. How do you create more value for the organization that you lead? And more value and purpose beyond the commercial enterprise. And I think we all have an obligation to do more for humanity or for your community. And so this is more of a values perspective and what value you are driving within your organization. And, quite frankly, it leads to greater productivity. If you are working against bigger values, bigger purpose, you're creating a culture that teams want to work for and they want to be productive in. So think about what your equity bucket looks like as you begin your planning for your business. Next slide, please. Now, this is a little bit off script, but I thought it was really important. Many of us are participants in solicitations and RFPs, right? And I've had a chance to talk to successful bidders, unsuccessful bidders. I've had an opportunity to talk to the interview panels. I've actually served on interview panels. And I think that there's often a bit of a disconnect of why one wins or loses. And one of those things and one of those areas is properly addressing the scope or objective of the request. Have you really responded adequately to the request, right? Are you addressing the questions being proposed? And on some of the feedback from some of the panels, they said, some of the bidders didn't actually address the questions that we presented to them. We didn't get a full spectrum of a response, and so we graded them down for that. The other question was, do you have a full understanding of what's being requested? And sometimes, quite frankly, RFPs aren't written in a way that's as clear as they could be, right? And so we must make certain that we understand what's being asked by the team. And sometimes we really don't understand all of the questions or all of the content that's being requested. And we need to request additional information so that we line up more appropriately. And here are a last couple of points. One is, if you are a successful bidder, you need to do a debrief with that team to find out what were the strengths? What did they like about your submission? What were the strengths and really positive aspects of your submission? Because what you want to be able to do is replicate success. You want to understand what they saw that you can leverage in upcoming submissions, right? If you are an unsuccessful bidder, even more reasons why you need to debrief with the team. You need to understand, was there something in that RFP? Was it your response, your written response? Was it your interview? Expect more. What are the things that you can learn within that debrief to make you a more successful bidder? Because we all struggle with solicitations, RFPs from time to time. And so I just wanted to just leave that with you just as food for thought. Okay, next slide. So when you think about this thing called branding and marketing, it's really about strategy, right? And it's really about brand positioning and creating a defined space that you own within the minds and hearts of your consumer and being motivating. We talked about Peloton, about the space that they got in our minds and hearts, right? In terms of exercise and wellness, right? And how we do it and how we think about it more globally than just sweating in my basement, right? Think about Starbucks and the community they created. It's all about positioning, right? It's about positioning. And it's also about spending your resources and efforts against your primary customer. Are you really clearly define, is your brand positioning aligned with the target audience? And if it isn't, it needs to be, because otherwise you're leaving a lot of volume and sales opportunity on the table. But you really need to make sure that your positioning really is speaking to your primary target. And then understanding your secondary target. Understand that competitive environments. And here's something, define the unmet needs of your customers. Do you know what they are? Are you sure that you're meeting all of the needs of your customers? Are you talking to them about gaps and opportunities, competitive gaps, right? And that's where, being more proactive, being really on top of your relationships with your customers and clients will allow you to really position yourself nicely with your clients. Next slide. So my perspective is the customer's perspective. The customer and looking through the eyes of the customer is critical. And this quote sort of sums it up. Customers are in charge now more than ever. They have great power and their expectations are shifting. We must put people at the center of everything that we do. So the question is, or the opportunity is, how do we look through the eyes of the customer? Not our eyes, right? Because what we see may not be what the customer see. So how do we have a customer first sort of navigational strategy that we're always through the minds of the customer? And the issue is leading a future where we're solving for the customer versus selling to the customer. And there's a big distinction. And often our propensity is sell, 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 sell all the time when we're in front of a client, right? But the bigger opportunity, the more important opportunity is solving problems for them, creating opportunity in that moment. You then distinguish yourself greatly from competitors, right? And I know it's hard. The propensity to want to sell, sell, sell is sort of, innate. But if you can hold back and really move towards problem solving versus selling, it'll position you nicely. Next slide. So I wanted to share sort of what I'm calling a perspective from the top. And these are comments from William White, who's the CMO of Walmart. And I know Walmart is a huge organization. They have a massive amount of resources. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is that the thinking applies to all of us, right? They believe in, and Mr. White believes that marketing must drive growth. And I agree with that 100%. Our marketing and branding efforts must drive growth. They also believe that that we must stay ahead of consumers and cultural trends. We just need to understand the directions that the customer is heading. We have to stay ahead of that within our businesses. And they talk about return on innovation, not return on investment, but return on innovation. What are you doing to innovate within your business for your clients and for the customers? Because the growth opportunity is in innovation, not with what you're doing, is what you're going to do next. Because consumers are shifting, their behaviors, their attitudes, their purchasing are shifting. And here's another point he made. He said, we have a shared vision and understanding of what marketing is. There's an alignment on what we're doing from a marketing and branding perspective that's shared. We're not in different camps around what our objectives are. And certainly their big initiative is to make life easier for their customers. And they want to shorten the distance between what they call inspiration and purchase, right? How do they close the gap between those two? And I really love their positioning, which is helping us save more so that we can have a better life. And they're beginning to lean more into this value of living a better life. Again, we talked earlier about sort of value, purpose driven. And then their thought is telling the why is as important as what we sell. Remember, we talked about solving problems, not just sell, but telling the why behind that. And at the end of the day, marketing is understanding people. Okay. Next slide. So their CMO was on a podcast more recently, and one of the questions that was asked of him is, what are the skills to be a good marketer? What are the skills to be a great leader? And honestly, I was expecting to hear, strategic insights, marketing expertise and acumen, and social media, digital expert, blah, 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 right? But interestingly enough, these are the skills and the characteristics that they're looking for. Listening to understand what your customers want. I didn't expect that as a response, but you know what? He's right. It is about listening to your customer. And he said, it's about being curious. What is the problem we are solving for? Being curious as leaders and certainly as marketers, and then understand what's going on in culture. What are the cultural trends that we're observing? And then lastly, we have to be empathetic. We have to care. We have to care about our customers. We have to care about our teams, and that we have to look through the eyes of the customer and our teams. And I thought that this was really good advice just in general to share with you today. Next slide. So when we think about determining marketing success, it truly is, and particularly in the environment we're in today, it's about our ability to change and adapt. It's absolutely imperative. We're living in an era of adaptation, and COVID has changed everything, hasn't it? We're shifting from what has been to what we don't know, in fact, right? And so all of our paths forward have changed forever. And so it's going to require that a one-size-fits-all mentality and approach won't work. It won't work in engaging consumers. It won't work for our businesses. We'll need agility. We'll need clarity moving forward. And there's so much disruption, and our ability to manage through this disruption and our ability to be agile, to be flexible, and to understand that change is a constant will bode well for us and moving forward. The other thing too is this notion of thinking about the various touch points along the consumer journey. Whatever your product and service is, what is that new customer journey look like for you? It's changed, trust me. What are you doing to understand that new customer journey? And then again, this is why the data points and research and the insights are so important, because it begins to inform your decisions, because you're going to place a bet somewhere, right? But what is that bet based on? It should be based on data and research and the insights that you have. This pandemic is going to extend for the foreseeable future. And it's really shifted consumer behavior in ways that we couldn't imagine just 2 years ago, right? And again, data, data, data. This is the other thing. How do you use data to build your personal story as a business owner? And the marketing efforts. We know that marketing efforts will always face ROI kinds of conversations, right? And obviously, smaller your organization is, there's a lot of pressure, right, on developing those tools to make better decisions. And so those analytical tools become part of your decision making, not just about marketing and branding, but across the breadth of what you do as a leader. And I think there's never a good time not to advertise, quite frankly, even in a pandemic, because you have to maintain a relationship with your most important clients. And the propensity is, let's pull back. We don't need to invest in our relationship or our future relationship with our clients, but it's just the opposite, actually. Next slide. So just some things to think about. These were the top marketing objectives for small businesses. 42% were concerned about customer acquisition, was where they thought they needed to place their spend post-COVID. 42% was around acquisition, customer acquisition. 27% was against brand awareness. 20% was against customer retention, right? 4% was about being an advocate for the customer. 4% was around what we call competitive conquesting. How can I take shots at my competitor? How can I just reposition myself vis-a-vis my competitor? And then 2% was against reduction of what is called churn or losing business, right? But it's interesting to see where small businesses are placing their bet post-COVID, right? And think about customer acquisition was bigger than customer retention. Look at that. It's interesting, isn't it? So what you're saying is the customers you don't have are more important to pursue than the customers you do have, right? That's really what that's saying. You're placing a bet on customers you don't have at 42% versus 20% retaining and growing with the customers you have. That's your base. That's your business. It's your current customers, right? So it's just interesting. I thought I would share this with you all as a last slide, but I found it really fascinating where small businesses are placing their bets in terms of investment and resources. So Liz, I'm through and a little early, so I'm happy to.
Great. Well, we have a couple of really good questions in chat. Okay. So we're going to start with the first one here, who's from Lee. I think we're asking for another mini session. He said, could you give us a quick coach up on how to increase the intrinsic value of our products, such as Starbucks increasing the intrinsic value of coffee from 50 cents to $5 a cup? I mean, how do we start? And what are the steps towards increasing intrinsic value?
Yes, that's a really, really great question. And one of the things that all of these companies do, and it's an exercise we can all do, is that they understand brand positioning and they've built a brand architecture for their brand. So in other words, they absolutely understand all of the elements. If you remember, I talked earlier about functional and emotional benefits of brands, right? We talked about Peloton, we talked about Tide as an example. Think about the characteristics of your brand, product, or service. Think about what is your competitive insight? What is your competitive advantage? What do you do differently? What do you do special or better than anyone else, right? And that sort of lands up to a personification. So if your brand was a car, is it a Chevy? Is it a Mercedes? Is it a Lamborghini? It really helps you think about where your brand is and ultimately, what is the essence of your brand? So for Nike, in a single word, it's about performance. So they've done all of this work and said, our brand is about performance over anything else. So when you think about Nike, I want you to think about performance, right? Now it took them, they didn't start there. They had to build up by asking the same thing. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are the characteristics? What are the What are the attributes of our brand? And I think it's a little bit of strategic work to go back and really do a self-evaluation and look at your brand and ask these same questions, right? What differentiates, for example, the Ritz-Carlton from the Hilton, right? Think about that. Think about the perception that the Ritz-Carlton has built in our minds as consumers versus what Hilton has done, right? But they have really made a commitment to understand the essence of their brand. And so I would suggest that you need to really understand the core essence of your brand, what you do, and what you offer that's unique for your customer. And you spend a lot of time thinking about it and debating that. And that ladders up to what that competitive advantage or that competitive insight that makes you different, unique, and a space that you can own. And it's hard work to get to that point. But if you do that work, you'll really find that you are really defining your space and your identity versus competitors in your same space, right? And that's why, the one point was, can you find a place that you can own in terms of the customer, right? That you become the sole provider of that product and or service versus being a competitor. Because once you're a competitor, you can lose on price, you can lose on a relationship, you can lose on a lot of variables. But if you are perceived as invaluable, like many of these brands are invaluable, they didn't start off that way, right? Starbucks started off in 1971 with one retail location, right? And so, so just think about that. And so the size is not as important as what we know and what we embrace around our brands and our ability to articulate that and design emotional and functional benefits that separate us from anyone else in that space.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ivan. And actually, as an attachment to that, we had another question in here. As a cutting edge technology company, how do we position our products and services so we do not scare established, entrenched industries? That's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one, which is, so I'll give you an example. So we have a client who is looking to be in the coffee space, right? Really wonderful, unique roasters. But the problem is, and after we did the research, is that where they want to locate themselves in proximity to Starbucks, they will be cannibalized. They just won't make it because of their proximity there. So part of it is to understand your position in the marketplace, own that well, because if your competitor has more resources and more market share, you don't want to be cannibalized too soon. So sometimes it's about proximity to your competitor, but more importantly, it's the differentiation. It's the different value, the special uniqueness of what you do. And if there is a competitive advantage that you can lean on that this major competitor doesn't, really build on that unique identity that you're bringing from a service provider perspective, even within the technology space, that is so different. And I would lean heavier on that than just generally competing with them en masse. So you got to find that special sauce, so to speak, right? The reason to believe that's different from the big competitor.
Thank you. And actually, I have a question now. And I am a small business owner of a small consulting business. I just started last year, and I was thinking about what you had here today, based on my website, because I'm just developing my website, and it brought a lot of questions to mind, and I started to think about where we're at now versus where we were pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and there was we've done a lot of live sessions, conferences. We've had collateral, signage. We have a different approach to business, including your branding, physical branding. And now it's really moved more towards the social media and the website. What's the importance of translating your brand going into that new era? You talked briefly about it, But this is a change in how we put things out there. We market because we're not necessarily in front of our potential customer. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, the great thing is that with the advent of digital and social media, there's so many things we can do to reach our customers so much more efficiently. We were talking yesterday about, you know, geofencing and programmatic ways to reach just your target. So for example, if you notice when you are doing a car search, let's say you're looking to buy a car and all of a sudden you get fed all of these ads from all of these car companies, right? And so they have information on us, right? And they begin, you know, do you want to talk now? You see, you want to have a chat about, you know, the new BMW? You want to have a, you know, do you want to drive? So social media allows us to pinpoint our audience so effectively, right? And those platforms are very effective, and then digital as well. So we are able to talk to our customers via social media and via digital really, really effectively. And one of the things that Zoom has done is put us all on a virtual platform, right? And so we're all accustomed to whether it's Google or Zoom or WebEx. And so these are ways that we can begin meeting customers in sort of virtual places and begin telling our stories. Think about all the podcasts and the growth of podcasts and people creating conversations. Thinking about all the engagement around interactivity. And so these are the spaces that I think we'll have to begin shifting to tell our stories or to begin having our customers get to know us better, begin a conversation with them. So that's my initial thought about what's happening.
Okay, I put a reminder out there. We do have 7 minutes remaining, so still a little bit of time. We need to get another question in here. And Lee is very engaging. Love it. Thanks, Lee. What exercises do you suggest for us to crystallize our message like Mercedes asking, what are we celebrating today in the showroom?
Right. You know, I think the process is a strategic process. It's around brand positioning and building a brand architecture, so you know exactly what you're and what that ladders up to. Once you get the brand position and the essence of your brand, you then develop a communication strategy, right? And that communication strategy is based on what you know about your brand that's different, that's unique, that's ownable, and that's special, right? And you communicate out of that, right? So it's the strategic work that Mercedes or any of these other companies, but they all go back to their brand positioning and the essence of their brand. They're never going to go away from that. Even if it's a promotional ad, it's still within the context of the work that they did to really understand and build out the brand work. And it's called brand architecture, building it out from the foundation. Think about building a house. It starts with an architectural design. Is it a split level? Is it a ranch? You know, what's happening inside? What makes it unique? Is it marble? What kind of floors? And it's sort of that same exercise that those brands, whether it's McDonald's, whether it's Mercedes, they do the same thing. They begin finding a space that they can own and building that space and that pathway into us as consumers. And the marketing and the media and the branding is an extension of what they've done strategically to identify what's unique, what's special, and what's ownable about their brands and product and service. Because think about it, Mercedes is in a competitive space. There are a lot of cars. So what makes me choose Mercedes over Lexus or Jaguar, right? So each of these brands have to be very clear about their identity and their communication because they can't be saying the same thing. Well, we're luxury. Well, so is Lexus. So is what's more, you have to be more special and more definitive from a communications strategy than that. So that's the process.
There's a lot to think about as you think about marketing and branding. It's just not as straightforward as one would think. We have an ask about any reading suggestions on positioning, brand architecture, etc.
Yeah, well, there's one book that I like a lot, and it's Blue Ocean Strategy. And I can't the author. I can't remember the name of the author. I apologize. But what I like about this book, it talks about differentiation in a big way. It talks about. It doesn't talk about brand architecture as much. Um, what I'll do is I'll need to identify a couple books that I think will work there. But the Blue Ocean talks about competition in a different kind of way. It talks about the creation of Uber, right? Uber doesn't own any cars, but yet they're one of the biggest players in the transportation space. It's talking about how do I move from a red ocean mindset to a blue ocean, where it's not competing with everyone, it's opening up another channel, right? And it's opening up another way to think about it. And that's why we talked earlier about return on innovation versus just a return on investment philosophy, right? But certainly the Blue Ocean is a really interesting um, read. And it really will put sort of competition and differentiation in real context. And Liz, I'll have to get back with you on some of the work around sort of the basic brand building text that I would recommend. Off the top of my head, I don't have the specific, but I'll get those and I'll be able to share those back.
Right. And I did look it up. Blue Ocean Strategy is a book by Renee Malbern and W. Chan Kim, and I can put that in the chat as well when we're done. And we're getting closer to close, but I think there's one last question in there. Has COVID killed guerrilla marketing? Not sure on that one. Sorry.
Well, it has the way that we think about it, or the way we thought about it in 2019, which is door to door and just all the physical, but it's actually gone online, right? So it's gone online, and that was the sort of the shift, is that it's going online. And think about the communities that are being built online for all sorts of products and services and issues, right? And so, no, I just think it's been repurposed and retooled, and we're seeing it play out in virtual spaces now more than sort of physical. But I think once we get the pandemic under control, it will come back, because at the end of the day, we still need that physical connection with each other, don't we? The virtual just doesn't cut it 100%, right? And so I think it will come back, but I think it's just been redeployed online.
Thank you, Ivan.
Sure.
As a startup, should we focus on a big splash new brand introduction or an ongoing stream of awareness?
That's an interesting question. I think the focus should be on sort of the brand identity work. Who are you? What's your identity? What is your position? I would spend a disproportionate amount of time in the strategy work, right? How you introduce yourself is different than who you are. So I think defining who you are and really getting laser focused on the essence of your brand, your competitive advantage versus anyone else, and getting that position nailed, and getting the essence of your brand or business nailed is where I would spend the disproportionate amount of time. Because if you do that right, then whether you do a soft launch, a big launch, whether you do a big splash or a virtual introduction of your business, the important thing is who are you and why should consumers or customers care about an introduction? And obviously, you want to sustain your image and your brand over time, beyond the introduction, because the introduction happens one time, right? Unless there's a line extension or a new product introduction, it is about sustaining the image. But what is that image you're sustaining? What is that image that you're introducing initially? So spend more time initially thinking about the position and the essence and the attributes of your brand that differentiates you from everyone else.
Okay, great. Next question. How should our marketing inform sales efforts, and how should sales inform marketing efforts to maintain a cohesive, consistent message?
That's a really, really wonderful question. And, I think that the Walmart example really expressed it best in terms of how they do it, right? And I believe it to be true for all businesses, which is, I think there has to be an alignment with marketing and sales on a couple of things. One is, what are we trying to accomplish for our customers from a marketing perspective, from a more of a macro perspective. And then how does sales come in and help us execute our marketing plans, right? So for example, one of the things we did when I worked at Coors, we would have joint meetings between sales and marketing. And so we as marketers would share out our annual plans with the sales team to talk about, are we hitting the mark? Are we talking to regional differences? Are we talking enough about specific opportunities around multicultural consumers? So we had an opportunity before we nailed our plans to look at what we are trying to accomplish in an upcoming year and have real conversations and sometimes real battles around where we should place our bet and where we should place our resources. But I think it starts with really the conversation up front and sharing out each other's plans and each other's goals for the year. And usually marketing is sort of the driver because all the advertising, all the program, all of the assets really come out of the marketing group. So the sales team has to be really aligned and really embrace that vision that marketing is saying and understand whether we're going to make progress from a volume perspective and set those targets and those goals in those initial meetings. So those cross-functional meetings early on between marketing and sales to set the table, I think are critical to make sure that there's a cohesive message and execution in the marketplace that we as consumers see.
Okay, great. There is another question here. Our services are based on data science-driven technology with an eye towards AI. What keyword statements best express the human side without being too nerdy or techy?
Yeah, that's and it's tough. That's interesting. How do you take something that's very technical and sort of connect the dot and really? Well, I think it's first of all understanding understanding a little bit more about the brand to really answer it in completely. But I would think that you've identified those functional attributes of your brand and what the technology does and the benefit that it provides. But how does it make my life better? How does it improve the quality of my life? Is moving more towards the emotional end of the scale, right? How does it improve my life? And if you think about the example with Walmart, it's we're here to save you money. Well, that's a real functional idea. It's a good idea, right? But it's leaning more towards having a better life, helping us have a better life was how they're moving more in that emotional realm. And once they found the sweet spot for them, which is helping us live a better life, they understood that as a higher value or as high value as just saving money, right? And I think in this example, sounds like you've clearly defined the technical benefits and values and characteristics, but it's how does it help me either have a better life? How does it engage me as a consumer, create more efficiency, make my life better? And so leaning more towards defining those emotional triggers, right? Those emotional triggers that connect beyond the technology, right? What are those unique, ownable, emotional qualities that you can think about that's consistent with your brand positioning and really is a motivator for your primary customers? And you might consider doing some groups, some qualitative groups to introduce some concepts, some emotional ideas, so that you sort of build to the emotional capital that we're speaking about, and take some of your core consumers, right, and get them in groups and have that conversation with them. Talk about some ideas around the emotional scale, and sort of think about what resonated. What are some of the things that connected them with you sort of more effectively? So I would do some testing with some of your core consumers to see how they react and what they think about some of the attributes around the emotional scale would look like. There might be some value in that.
Great. Well, we have a few more questions that came into chat, and we still have about 10 minutes before we move to the main area. First question, what are the top key traits that you would suggest to begin or restart marketing our business?
Again, that's difficult in isolation to address specifically, but again, I think it's, again, talking about who you are to your consumers, who you are personally, what's your brand identity, who are you as a brand, product, or service, and get alignment there first. Who are we and who do we want to be moving forward? Who's our primary customer, and really define that. And then what are we offering our most important customers? What's uniquely different? What's valuable to offer? And so again, I think it's really more strategic work and internal conversations. And then I would add to that conversation some qualitative work with your most important customers. Get them involved in the conversation, get their perspective of what's working, what's not working, whether it's a communication, whether it's a product benefit, whether it's an opportunity to close a competitive gap. But I would make that part of the exercise and use that as a basis for then having sort of a broader conversation of moving forward. And then you develop a communication strategy around that that's more external facing and connecting more to your customers.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Another question, how do we tell if we are branding incorrectly? Outside of
Well,
lack of customers, I guess.
yeah, well, yeah, lack of customer, lack of engagement. You know, it's really interesting. One of the things that brands do, big brands, small, you know, they do an assessment every year. So before planning the following fiscal year, they do an assessment. And part of that is they take an assessment of what they're communicating to their primary customers. They do an audit of their sales activities. Did they underperform or overperform? What are some of the nuances in their sales activity? What did they learn from research about how their message is connecting to consumers? And they tweak. So I think the message is you don't want to stay in a bad place long, right? It's about always assessing, always talking to your customers, always looking for moments to have a return on innovation and looking more forward, thinking about solving problems versus selling, right? And how do you really drive that mindset as a cultural attribute that you value as an organization? But it's really about understanding the data and always doing the assessment, involving your teams cross-functionally in that self-assessment every year as you plan in terms of your resources and your plans for your customers and consumers and your clients in the upcoming year.
Okay, great. There's a few more that came in. We'll see if we can get at least one of these in before we end out. How do we merge emotional marketing tools from the past with the new data-driven tools and techniques? And once tests are done, how do we best leverage data to target customers and grow market share?
Right. Yeah. And that's, remember earlier we talked about the customer journey. So think about your customer journey and the touch points along the way on your customer journey. And so I believe in mapping out what that journey looks like today. What does that journey look like today? And if you have historical data, what did it look like pre-COVID, right? What's changed on the customer journey for you and for your business, for your products and service? What has changed, right? Do you have input about what customers will or will not do differently post-COVID? Have you put that into that customer journey, right? Because it's all about the customer experience and how we address the needs of the customer sort of post-COVID. And so I think you got to do some modeling to understand where they are today versus yesterday. And then emotionally, the emotional benefit has to be part of your brand construct, right? So your brand architect always has to have that rational and emotional connection, right? And how you execute that. So if you recall, like during COVID, there were a lot of brands that changed their messaging to things like, we're all in it together, support the nurses, support the medical community. They changed away from selling into sort of this emotional moment. And so you have to sort of measure out the importance of that messaging versus more of the sort of the functional messaging. But I believe that effective communication has to combine both functional and emotional all the time, right? And great brands who do it well, like the brands we talked about earlier, they find a way to integrate both functional and emotional benefits well, right? They don't ever move away from their functional unique point of difference. But when they add that emotional layer, that begins really separating their brands from the competitive set. So it's finding that sweet spot that merges both functional and emotional benefits, but placing that on that journey map in terms of your consumers.
Great. There's still a couple of questions. This next question will probably have about 2 minutes before we have to close out, Ivan. But
Okay.
these are great, and you have great responses here. Well, the Elon Musk model of the owner being the face of the brand, face of the franchise, seems to be growing in popularity. Is this the future? And how do more introverted owners maintain connection with customers and the audience without being so public?
You know, I don't know that's right for everyone. That the owner, you know, a lot of owners aren't charismatic, and they may be introverted. I don't know that that's necessary, and certainly depending on the product and or services, there could be another face of the brand. There are a lot of folks who run brands or run organizations that we don't know, that are not external facing, right? So the success of the brand is not necessarily on a charismatic leader. It certainly helps when you have a charismatic leader. You can leverage that. But in many instances, a lot of leaders aren't that charismatic and don't have an external facing that the consumer care about or your primary customer care about. So I think you got to lead with what works for your brand, product, or service. And if it's someone within the organization is best suited for that, great. But if not, I think you just got to lead with what you do best and what is your most important difference and what is your greatest value for your customer.
Great. That's an excellent response. Thank you so much. And thank you to those in the audience that were able to provide these great questions and get some good feedback. It is now 10:58, and I want to thank you, Ivan, for taking the time to share with our MBEs. And I'm sure this is valuable information and will be applied to a greater value and profitability. And we appreciate you taking time to share this valuable content. We're at the top of the hour. It's time for another break. And the next session that we'll be having will start in 10 minutes past the hour. So again, you're going to automatically be relocated to the pre-assigned workshop, or I think it's actually an event that's happening. We want you to enjoy your break, and we're going to see you in about 10 minutes past the hour. So you have a few minutes here to take a breather and step off as needed. And there was a comment. He said, "This guy is amazing."
Thank you.
I absolutely agree. I learned so much from this session, and I know others did well because we had some great questions as well. I learned so much from this, and things to do, but things not to do.
You're right.
So it was really good, and it's making me rethink a lot of things as well. So again, thank you for everything you provided.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you to the audience. There were some really wonderful questions, and thank everyone for participating.